Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a deep dive. Today we're tackling a subject that, well, it sits right at the heart of some very personal experiences and big societal conversations: abortion.
Yeah.
We know this topic carries a lot of weight, evokes strong feelings for many people.
Absolutely. And just acknowledging that up front is really, really important. Our goal here, though, isn't to wade into the usual ethical or political discussions you hear everywhere else.
Exactly. Our mission, like always, is to take your source material, and today that's a transcript from a YouTube interview, and really explore the world it presents, but, on its own terms.
Mhm.
And this source offers a really unique angle, doesn't it? Looking at abortion through the lens of the soul's journey, its intentions, drawing on ideas from things like regression and reincarnation therapy.
That's right. So what we're doing here is impartially examining the core ideas, and maybe some surprising insights, that are found only within this specific material. We're not bringing in other views. We're definitely not endorsing the ideas presented.
No.
It's really about helping you understand this particular perspective, just as it's laid out in the source we were given.
Got it. So, where does this source even begin? It seems to rest on a pretty fundamental assumption, one that's quite different from how we might typically think about life.
It really does. It starts with the idea that we're more than just our physical selves, that there's a soul, a consciousness that exists before we're born and continues after physical life ends.
Okay, the existence of the soul as a starting point.
That's the bedrock, yeah. And absolutely central to this source is the distinction it draws between what it calls the soul-logical perspective, that's the soul's viewpoint, and the ratiological view, our everyday rational mind.
So logical versus ratiological. And understanding that difference is pretty crucial for everything else in the source, right?
Totally. Because from this soul-logical viewpoint, the source suggests that our usual rational, maybe law-based discussions, while they have their place, well, they're seen as limited.
Limited.
Limited. Because they apparently miss the essence, as the source puts it, the deeper meaning or reality of the experience from that spiritual dimension. It frames everything through that lens. Conception, abortion. It's all seen as part of the soul's intentional journey.
Okay, so if we accept that framework just for the sake of understanding the source, where does it take us next? This is where it gets really interesting, I think, and maybe quite counterintuitive.
Definitely. According to this source, when conception actually happens and a soul starts to approach, that soul makes a conscious decision to come into that specific life.
A conscious decision by the soul itself, not just biology or chance.
Exactly. It's presented as an intentional act, something rooted in that soul's purpose, its soul being, as the source calls it.
Wow, okay, and the source takes that even further, suggesting this decision might include possibilities like abortion or miscarriage.
Yes. That's a key point here. From this perspective, those outcomes aren't necessarily seen as, like, failures or tragedies interrupting a plan. They could actually be part of the larger journey or trajectory the soul mapped out for itself.
Part of the plan. So an abortion could be foreseen, even chosen in some way by the soul.
The source floats that idea, yeah. It even suggests the soul might choose a path knowing abortion is a possibility, maybe specifically to create a challenge for the mother.
A challenge? Like what?
For instance, the source mentions encouraging the mother to choose for herself, maybe if she's under a lot of external pressure or hasn't found her own voice yet.
Huh. So the soul steps onto a path that includes this potentially traumatic event as a catalyst for growth, for itself or for the others involved.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
And the source does note there's a spectrum. Some souls might be really determined. Hard-necking is the word used, like persistent or stubborn in their desire to come through,
Okay.
while others might approach with maybe more doubt or less certainty.
Yeah.
But the core idea is that the initial decision to engage comes from the soul.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift then. What does the source say about the impact of an abortion specifically on the mother? It talks about a wound, right?
Yes, it states that pretty clearly. An abortion leaves a one-aged-er. A wound remains.
And is that just physical? Or
No, according to the source, it's definitely not just physical. It extends into the energetic body, too, what it calls the etheric body.
an energetic wound? What does that feel like? Or how does the source describe that experience for her?
Well, it uses this really interesting image. It talks about the uterus itself.
Yeah.
It says the uterus, biologically, doesn't understand what happened.
Doesn't understand.
Yeah, because its natural program is to nourish, to grow life, and then suddenly the child is gone. The source suggests this biological program gets cut short without a sense of completion.
Ah.
And that unresolved energy, that interruption, could potentially cause issues later on, physically or energetically.
That's a powerful idea.
Um,
The body holding this sort of unresolved memory. And this wound, both physical and energetic, the source says it can lead to other problems.
According to the source, yes. It lists potential consequences like physical complaints, psychological distress, emotional difficulties,
Yeah.
things like guilt, shame, feeling isolated, even developing a fear of future pregnancy or experiencing infertility. These are all mentioned as possible outcomes connected to that unresolved wound.
And how does the source view the way society often handles this? Or the way individuals might?
It has a very strong take on that. It describes suppressing the experience. The phrase used is "nake over heaven," basically not talking about it or treating it only as a physical phenomenon.
Yeah.
It calls that the dumbest thing you can do nowadays.
Wow, okay. Strong words.
Very.
Yeah.
The emphasis is squarely on needing to acknowledge and process the whole experience, well beyond just the physical aspect.
So trying to ignore the emotional and energetic layers just makes it worse from this perspective?
That's exactly the message.
Yeah.
And then the source makes another really key claim. It says that contact can actually be made later on with the conscious soul of the aborted child.
Contact with the soul. How? It doesn't specify.
It doesn't detail the how in the snippet we have, but it stresses the possibility.
And making that connection, according to the source, that's what can lead to fundamental changes, to healing for the mother.
Yes, it's presented almost as a necessary step for truly resolving that deep wound.
Okay, that covers the mother's perspective according to the source. What about the child's soul? How does the source describe the abortion experience from its viewpoint?
Well, once the soul is sort of intertwined with the mother's consciousness, actually in the womb, the event of the abortion itself is described as a traumatic experience for that soul.
So hang on. Even if the soul, from a higher level, chose a path including that possibility, the actual experience, once it's connected to the physical, is still traumatic for it.
That seems to be the distinction the source makes, yes.
Mm.
The higher soul perspective might choose the potential trajectory, maybe for learning, but the soul actually engaging with that physical reality, experiencing that abrupt end that's felt as trauma.
Okay. And what happens to that soul then, according to this view?
The source suggests this soul isn't lost or destroyed. It can potentially return later.
Return. How?
It might come back in a subsequent child born to the same mother or the same father, or even choose to incarnate somewhere else entirely.
And if it does return to the same parents, say in a later sibling, what does it bring with it? Does it remember?
According to the source, yes, it carries that original trauma, and specifically a fear of unpredictability stemming from that first experience.
And how would that show up in the family dynamics?
Exactly, particularly in the relationship with the mother, the source suggests.
How so? What might that look like?
It suggests it could manifest in difficult ways, maybe as conflict situations, really challenging interactions, or even sometimes as enormous dependence.
Dependence. Why dependence?
Because the idea is, on some subconscious or soul level, the child's soul is still seeking acknowledgement and healing for that past abortion event. It's trying to bring that unresolved trauma into the current relationship so it can finally be seen and healed.
Wow. Bringing the old wound into the present to get attention. Okay, let's pivot slightly. What about the father? The source mentions the father's role too, calls it crucial, right? And involving thick responsibility.
Yes, it does. While obviously the mother carries the direct physical experience, the father's energetic involvement, his presence, his support, or maybe his lack of it, is seen as highly significant in this framework.
And there's a really striking idea presented about fathers who are, say, dismissive or who abandon the situation, treat it lightly, like playing with life, as the source puts it.
Yeah, that's a challenging part of the text.
What does the source suggest might happen from that soul perspective?
It posits that the soul of such a father might, perhaps in a future incarnation, solicit, that's the word used, or essentially choose to experience being aborted itself.
Whoa. To understand it from the other side, to feel what that's like.
Exactly. The source frames it almost as a form of karmic balancing, a way for the soul to feel what his own curse actually entails. It suggests the soul seeks to grasp the full impact of its past actions by experiencing the receiving end.
That's a profound and quite confronting concept presented there. Okay, the source doesn't stop there though, does it? It broadens the view even wider, connecting these personal events to ancestral patterns.
Yes, this is a really major theme in this perspective. It sees our individual experiences as often deeply interwoven with unresolved stuff from our family history, even going back generations. Historical trauma.
And it gives some pretty potent examples, doesn't it? Like thinking about grandmothers during wartime.
It does. It specifically mentions grandmothers who might have faced horrific situations, like forced sex, or finding themselves pregnant in desperate circumstances and needing to self-abort using dangerous methods. It refers to the Brenal de Verhaal, the story of using a knitting needle.
Oh, wow. Heavy.
Very. And the source says the secrets, geheim sich der allemaal heeft afgespielt, the secrecy surrounding these traumatic events, creates these wounds, but in the energetic field of the whole family system. And these wounds get passed down.
Passed down energetically, how does that manifest?
Through what the source calls ancestral overtweaking, these deep-seated, often unconscious convictions.
Hmm.
For example, maybe a conviction that getting pregnant means something life-threatening based on those past traumas.
Okay.
And these convictions, held in the family field, can then apparently manifest in later generations. The source even makes a connection to physical issues like infertility, describing it from this energetic view as potentially causing an acidic uterus.
An acidic uterus, caused by ancestral beliefs.
Caused by these old, unaddressed fear patterns held energetically in the system, yes. That's the idea presented.
So these Grafgeheimen, these secrets from the grave, they can literally burden descendants generations later.
Precisely. The source talks about a herhaling van zetten, or repetition of patterns, the same themes, the same struggles, playing out again and again across the generations until they're addressed.
And healing then involves
Bringing those old stories out of shadows, giving them utterance, allowing them to be spoken, acknowledged, felt. That's how the pattern gets broken, according to this source.
It sounds like from this perspective, if we fail to address these deeper wounds, personal and ancestral, it leads to all sorts of issues cropping up in modern life, maybe as symptoms.
It does seem to draw that connection. The source links some modern challenges directly back to these deeper collective and ancestral wounds. It even mentions the concept of on-theming.
On-theming, what's that?
Losing connection to one's roots, one's ancestral ground or Heimat. It relates this particularly to experiences like migration, saying it creates a kind of fundamental wound in the basis, a sense of being ungrounded.
And how might that manifest today?
Well, the source suggests this deep wound, this lack of grounding, can lead to things like sexuality becoming a Kompensatiefveld,
A compensation field, meaning
meaning a place where people might unconsciously act out their psychological needs because they're disconnected from deeper roots. And this, the source suggests, can create a rather turbulent environment, energetically speaking, which might then attract souls needing to incarnate into those kinds of complex situations.
And the source also touches on modern reproductive technologies like IVF, but not from the usual ethical angle, right?
No, it's not framed as a moral judgment at all. It views techniques like IVF as attempts, perhaps, to control creation.
Control creation.
Yeah, seeing it as diverging from what it calls the natural flow rooted in the love between man and woman. It's presented simply as a different path, one that results in the incarnating soul internalizing clinical influences from the process.
So less about good or bad, more about the different energetic quality or experience of that path to incarnation.
Exactly. And importantly, the source does acknowledge that souls do consciously choose these paths too. It's not saying they shouldn't exist. Often it suggests choosing IVF or similar paths is connected to working through really complex family or ancestral healing processes that need to unfold in that specific way.
Okay.
But the broader point ties back. If we don't deal with the root traumas, the ancestral stuff, we might find ourselves reaching for what the source calls plastic solutions or just symptom treatment, rather than going for the deeper healing.
Which loops us right back to healing. And the source's main message there seems to be all about acknowledgement, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That seems paramount. Healing, from this perspective, really starts by making secrets bespreekbaar, making them discussable, having the courage to walk into the field of the experience.
Face the reality of it.
Face the reality, yes, personally, ancestrally, confronting what actually happened.
And also reconnecting with the affected soul, the soul of the child, and trying to understand that wider context, including those family patterns we talked about.
Yes, that connection is presented as crucial for finding resolution. The source uses that really intense but illustrative anecdote you mentioned earlier about the WWII SS officer and the Jewish woman.
Right, as an example of souls caught in trauma across lifetime.
Exactly. Caught in a deep verstrangling, an entanglement because of extreme trauma, and seeking harmony, resolution, possibly by reconnecting in later lives to somehow work through that incredibly heavy unresolved history. It's an extreme case used to illustrate the principle of these soul-level connections persisting.
It really drives home the idea that these connections, these unresolved issues, aren't just confined to one lifespan in this view. And the source also said something about children born later being super powerful.
Yes, super powerful in bringing these old, often buried stories to the surface for their parents and the family system. Often through creating challenging dynamics, apparently. It's like they intuitively know what needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
And their behavior, their struggles, their very presence can nudge the whole system towards finally acknowledging what's been suppressed. They're seen as active participants in this ongoing process of seeking harmony.
Okay. So if we try to pull this all together,
Oh,
this unique perspective from the source presents abortion not just as a physical event or a purely rational choice or even just an ethical dilemma,
right.
but as something deeply interwoven with the soul's conscious journey, heavily influenced by ancestral patterns, and part of this much larger multi-generational, maybe even multi-lifetime process of finding balance and harmony.
It really does offer a profoundly different framework for thinking about what is, undeniably, an incredibly complex and sensitive topic. It centers the soul's intention and the weight of family history in a way you don't often hear.
So, as you, the listener, reflect on all this, maybe consider how this specific perspective, drawn purely from this source material, challenges your own thinking, or perhaps how it might offer a different lens for understanding personal experiences, or even collective ones, related to this subject.
Yeah, and the source kind of leaves us with this final, quite provocative image, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests that no matter how hard we might try to control things or manipulate them or hide from these fundamental, call them biological and spiritual laws of creation,
Mm,
that underlying drive for harmony, for connection, which it says is ultimately rooted in ancestral love, that drive will always find a way to push through.
like on Cruid, like weeds forcing their way up through asphalt, through asphalt.
It strongly implies that maybe real healing, true understanding, doesn't come from more control or suppression, what the source calls underdrugged, but actually from having the courage to acknowledge these deeper, often hidden realities.